When Edward Hayward's life ended at the hands of a ruthless prospector in the Alberta woods in 1904, there were no witnesses, except for the victim's brother, who was 6,000 miles away. George Hayward awoke in England from a clairvoyant dream that showed the foul deed in such detail that he travelled to Canada to inform the investigators and, astonishingly, was even able to ID the perpetrator. In the early hours of September 18, 1904, George Hayward awakened in his English home in a cold sweat. With trembling fingers, he lit a candle, found paper and a pencil, and wrote down a description of the terrifying nightmare which had disturbed his sleep. He was careful to record as much of the vivid dream as he could remember, down to the gruesome details. Some inner instinct told him that this was important. He had dreamt of a dark pine forest near a native Canadian village where suddenly 2 white men rode past. They stopped by the side of a swamp, tethered their horses to a tree, and laid out their woolen blankets. The moonlight revealed to George that one of the travellers, tall with a black beard, was his own brother, Edward. As the pair set up camp, a native Canadian woman carrying a woven basket approached them. She was just about to speak when the 2 white men started arguing. As the frightened woman withdrew, the argument quickly escalated into a vicious brawl. Eventually, the shorter man grabbed a rifle and ended Edward's life. George watched appalled as the man then built a bonfire, dragged his brother's lifeless form onto the pyre, and threw some of his belongings into the swamp. It was several days later that North Central Alberta lawman, Staff Sergeant Christian Anderson of the Royal North West Mounted Police, headed out on patrol, and half a world away from George Hayward in his English abode. After guiding his horse down a winding trail, Anderson was met by Miss Toos, the chief of the Sucker Creek First Nation, who told him of the 2 prospectors. 2 days after their arrival, one named Charlie had ridden off with all the horses, his black-bearded partner now nowhere to be seen. Strangely, the 2 men had built an enormous bonfire the night of his disappearance, despite the pleasant mildness of the evening. Just as ominous, Miss Too's cattle had bayed anxiously and poured the ashes of the bonfire as if scenting blood. Miss Toos also introduced Anderson to 2 boys who had visited the white men several days earlier. The tall Englishman, who wore a large shining buckle on his belt, was followed everywhere by a loyal yellow dog. The morning after his disappearance, Charlie was seen physically dragging the dog away from the campsite. For some reason, it was refusing to leave. At the site of the prospectors' camp, Anderson sifted through the bonfire ashes and quickly uncovered several charred fragments of bone. He waded into the nearby swamp, which he then dragged with a rake, retrieving the men's battered kettle. Before leaving the reserve, Anderson came upon Charlie King in the cabin of a local trapper. On being told of Anderson's investigation, King related in a friendly, matter-of-fact manner that he had met a stranger called Lehman in the nearby sandhills. After camping together, Lehman had set out on foot for Sturgeon Lake, where he hoped to do some prospecting. He had asked King to look after his horses for him during his absence. A week-long mounted police search and interviews along the trail to Sturgeon Lake, however, found no one who had seen a man matching the description of the missing prospector. This convinced Anderson to secure a warrant for the arrest of Charlie King, who was found waiting with his luggage on the shores of the Great Lake, about to flee by steamer. He was jailed, much to the outrage of local trappers, who swore by King's innocence. After the arrest, Anderson unearthed more shards of charred bone, a waistcoat buckle, and a broken half of a large needle from the men's campfire. Local First Nations people dragged the swamp to find a pair of soggy boots containing further possessions, including Edward's silver belt buckle and a thin piece of broken steel. The steel fragment fitted perfectly the needle recovered from the ashes, linking the items from the swamp with the bones from the campfire. Anderson finally traced Hayward's purchase of a bear trap to a trader who recalled the sale to a black-bearded Englishman the previous summer. Curiously, the cheque was signed Edward Hayward, whereas Charlie King had said that his partner's name was Lehman. The answer to this quandary was found at the Edmonton Hotel, where on the August 14th register were two adjacent names, Charles King and Edward Hayward. The men's trunks were still being stored in the basement, and Edward's contained a letter from his brother George. Consequently, a letter was sent to George in England inquiring as to whether he had any knowledge of his brother's whereabouts. In the meantime, Anderson's inquiry escalated as he was able to further verify Edward's purchase of his horses. He even impersonated a lumberjack to garner information from members of a logging crew with whom Edward had worked. They remembered the various objects found in the swamp as belonging to the victim. This success was moderated by a report from Salt Lake City that Charlie King, the suspect, was known to be a hard-working farmer and without a stain to his character. Soon an English sailor was to walk into the office of one of the investigating Mounties. He identified himself as George Hayward, the brother of the missing man. Asking the officer if he believed in dreams, and despite receiving a reply in the negative, he proceeded to tell the Mountie of the bizarre nightmare he had experienced the previous September. Amazingly, the details of the dream in which his brother Edward had met his end at the hands of his partner were astoundingly identical with the finds made at the crime scene, of which Hayward had no way of knowing. Even more astonishing was the piece of paper which Hayward took from his pocket. The screed was a clipping from an English newspaper which appeared to corroborate the Englishman's account. The day after his horrific dream, Hayward described his experience to a group of friends at his favourite tavern, and the story eventually made its way into the local paper. It turned out that George Hayward had dreamed his extraordinary dream on the very night that his brother had disappeared. The astonished officer asked George if he was agreeable to attending the Fort Saskatchewan Penitentiary to see if he could identify the subject of his dream. 2 hours later, George Hayward had been conveyed there and was watching inmates shuffle past in a file. Suddenly, he grabbed the Mountie's arm, whispering, "That's him," in a trembling voice. "The same man I saw kill Ed in my dream." The man, George pointed out, was none other than Charlie King. Exactly 1 year after George's dream, Charles King stood trial for the murder of his brother Edward. Due to his scrupulous forensic investigations, Staff Sergeant Christian Anderson, who served as the Crown prosecutor, presented evidence from 80 witnesses to build a strong case of King's guilt. The native Canadian woman, who had been intending to sell moccasins to the two prospectors but fled when she saw the argument brewing, had also come forward as a witness. She had heard the fatal retort of the gun. Edward's brother George Hayward from England was present at the hearing, and his stunningly accurate dream is still remembered as a mysterious example of the power of ESP.